Here is a question that sounds simple. How do you measure a cornerback who quarterbacks refuse to throw at? Think about what that actually means. In a sport built entirely on statistical documentation, touchdowns, yards, completions, interceptions, the greatest compliment you can pay to a defensive back is one that leaves almost no paper trail. If nobody throws your way, your interception total stays low. Your tackle count stays low. Your stat line looks ordinary because the offense made a decision before the ball was even snapped to make you irrelevant. That was Deion Sanders for the better part of a decade. Prime time. Neon Deion. The most electrically gifted cover corner the NFL had ever seen, and one of the most genuinely difficult players in the history of the sport to evaluate by the numbers, precisely because his greatest seasons are the ones where the numbers tell you the least. He also played professional baseball at the same time and appeared in both a Super Bowl and a World Series. Nobody else in American sports history has done that. So the question for this episode is bigger than just football, and it's more complicated than a stat line. It's about what a player's actual value is when the traditional tools of measurement struggle to capture it, and whether two sports played simultaneously adds to a legacy or dilutes it. How good was Deion Sanders actually? Sanders entered the NFL in 1989 as the fifth overall pick of the Atlanta Falcons, and the league he walked into was a fundamentally different defensive environment than what exists today. Through the early and mid 1990s, defensive backs could use significant physical contact with receivers well beyond the line of scrimmage. Handchecking was legal. Defenders could ride a receiver off their route, disrupt timing, make the passing game physically uncomfortable in ways the rulebook no longer permits. The cornerback position rewarded physicality and press coverage in a way that suited certain players and punished others. Sanders was not that kind of cornerback. What he brought to the position was something different: pure, almost supernatural speed and anticipation that made physical contact largely unnecessary. He didn't need to disrupt routes because he could run with anyone at any point in a route. He didn't need to hold because he could simply stay in front of his man. The NFL progressively tightened its contact rules through the 1990s and into the 2000s, culminating in significant restrictions on defensive back contact past 5 yards. Changes widely understood as a response to how physical defense had become. By the time those rules tightened fully, Sanders was approaching the end of his career. He played through the most physically permissive era of the modern game against offenses that were growing more sophisticated year by year, and he handled both. To understand what Sanders was doing, you need to understand what an elite cornerback was supposed to look like in the 1990s. The dominant model of the era was the complete cornerback, a player who could cover, tackle, support the run, and play the physical game within the rules of the time. Rod Woodson in Pittsburgh, Darrell Green in Washington, Aeneas Williams in Phoenix and St. Louis. These were players whose value came from doing everything the position asked and doing it at a high level. Sanders deliberately diverged from this model. He was a cover specialist at a time when the position didn't really have cover specialists. It had complete defensive backs. His choice to essentially opt out of run support and focus almost entirely on coverage was, depending on your perspective, either the most intelligent positional decision in NFL history or a fundamental refusal to do the full job. That tension is the spine of his entire evaluation. We'll come back to it. While all of this was happening in football, Sanders was also playing professional baseball, not as a stunt, not as a publicity move, but as a legitimate roster player for multiple MLB organizations over 9 non-consecutive seasons. The baseball world he played in was the same steroid era environment we covered in the Jeter episode. High offense, inflated numbers league wide, a premium on power that didn't particularly suit Sanders' game. His value in baseball was almost entirely speed based, which put him in a specific box. He could get on base by finding gaps and beating out grounders, and he could run wild once he was on. What he couldn't do was hit for power or post the on base percentage a team needs from a leadoff man. The non consecutive nature of his MLB career is important context for everything that follows. In most of his MLB seasons, he played 50 to 100 games before leaving to join his NFL team. He was never a full season baseball player. That limits the meaningful statistical comparison to anyone who committed to the sport completely, which Sanders never did and never claimed to. Start with the accolades, because for a cornerback in an era with limited comprehensive tracking data, the accolades carry more evidential weight than they would for an offensive player. 8 Pro Bowls, 6 first team All Pro selections, the 1994 NFL Defensive Player of the Year, 2 Super Bowl rings, named to the NFL's All Decade team for the 1990s as both a cornerback and a punt returner, which is an almost unheard of dual designation. Named to the NFL 100 All Time Team in 2019, the official selection of the 100 greatest players in league history. Inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame on the first ballot in 2011. Pro Football Reference's Hall of Fame Monitor, which scores players against the historical benchmarks of Hall of Fame inductees at their position, gives Sanders a score of 171.03. The average Hall of Fame defensive back scores 96.93. Sanders nearly doubles that average. Among all defensive backs in PFR's database, he ranks second. His career interception total was 53, with 1,331 return yards and 9 touchdowns on those returns. He also scored 6 touchdowns on punt returns and 3 on kickoff returns. His total non offensive touchdown count puts him in a scoring category more comparable to a receiver than a defensive back. His interception return yardage total ranked second all time at the point of his retirement. And while the defensive numbers tell most of his story, Sanders was also used as an offensive weapon throughout his career, something almost no cornerback at any level could claim. In 1996 with the Dallas Cowboys, he lined up at wide receiver for his 36 receptions, 475 yards, and a touchdown. Numbers that would be respectable for a dedicated slot receiver, let alone a player whose primary job was on the other side of the ball. He finished that season with 477 total scrimmage yards and was named first team All Pro as a cornerback in the same year he was moonlighting as a receiver. He saw smaller offensive usage in several other seasons and even logged snaps on offense after coming out of retirement with the Baltimore Ravens. None of it approaches 1996 in volume, but the pattern across his career points to something the box score doesn't fully capture: that the Cowboys and other coaching staffs viewed Sanders as a weapon too valuable to leave on the field only half the time. If there's a single season that makes the case for Sanders as the greatest cornerback who ever played, it is 1994 with the San Francisco 49ers. He led the NFL in interception return yards with 303. He had 3 interception return touchdowns, including a 74-yarder, a 93-yarder, and a 90-yarder against the Chargers in the Super Bowl. He became the first player in NFL history to record 2 interception returns of 90 or more yards for touchdowns in the same season. The 49ers went 13-3 and won Super Bowl 29. Sanders finished third in MVP voting, losing to his own quarterback Steve Young. A defensive back finishing third in MVP voting on the best team in football is not a routine outcome. What the stat line from 1994 doesn't show is what was happening on the other side of it. Quarterbacks had spent the season making the decision that before every snap to go somewhere else, when the most dangerous weapon in your arsenal is the threat of what you might do. The traditional box score has no column for that. The tackling question is the part of the Sanders evaluation that gets the most attention, and it deserves to be handled carefully because the popular version of the argument is somewhat overstated. Sanders' career tackle total across 188 games was 492, roughly 2.6 per game. For a starting cornerback, that is on the lower end of average, not historically catastrophic. The narrative that Sanders simply refused to tackle is a cleaner story than the numbers actually support. What is documented is the attitude more than the absence. Sanders describes certain contact situations as, quote, business decisions, a deliberate calculation about when absorbing a hit from a large ball carrier was worth the injury risk to a player whose entire value was tied to his speed and movement. PFF noted that Sanders was among the first players to bring real scrutiny to the question of whether a cornerback's tackling should be evaluated the same way as other positions. Tony Romo raised the issue publicly in a 2017 CBS broadcast, comparing Marcus Peters unfavorably to Sanders on willingness to make contact. Sanders pushed back. The conversation was notable less because the tackles numbers were catastrophic, and more because it exposed a genuine philosophical divide about what a shutdown corner's job actually is. The honest framing is this: Sanders was a below average tackler for the position who was an all time elite coverage player. Those two things coexisted, and the coverage value so thoroughly outweighed the tackling limitation that his teams won 2 Super Bowls with him playing this way. The tackling is a real caveat to his legacy. It just isn't the historically damning indictment it's sometimes presented as. Across 9 non-consecutive MLB seasons, Sanders played 641 games and posted a career slash line of 263 average, 319 on base percentage, and 392 slugging percentage, and an OPS plus of 89. An OPS plus of 89 means he was approximately 11% below the average major league hitter during his era. His career WAR of 5.5 over those 9 seasons is roughly what a solid utility player accumulates. Meaningful, but not impactful. He was not a player who was going to anchor an offensive lineup or carry a team at the plate. Where he was elite was on the bases. 186 career stolen bases with strong success rates. In 1997, with the Cincinnati Reds, his best baseball season, he hit 273 with 56 stolen bases in 115 games, finishing second in the National League in steals behind Tony Womack's 60. And when the moment was biggest, he showed up. In the 1992 World Series against the Toronto Blue Jays, Sanders hit 533 with a 1255 OPS across 4 games. Numbers that would look good for any professional hitter in October, let alone a player whose primary profession was cornerback. The Braves lost the series in 6 games, but Sanders' individual performance in it was the strongest evidence that his baseball career was real, not ceremonial. Combined with 2 Super Bowl appearances, that makes him the only athlete in American professional sports history to appear in both the Super Bowl and a World Series. The honest read on Sanders' baseball career is that he was a functional major league player whose value was almost entirely speed based, whose hitting was below average, and whose commitment to the sport was always secondary to football. He never played a full season in the traditional sense. What he did, holding a professional roster spot in 2 major American sports simultaneously for years, has no precedent and no real comparison point. This section deserves its own space because it's the question that shapes everything else about how you evaluate Sanders, and it doesn't have a clean analytical answer. Did playing 2 professional sports simultaneously make Deion Sanders better, worse, or just different as a football player? The evidence suggests it didn't hurt his football career in any measurable way. He won 2 Super Bowls, he won DPOY honors, he earned 6 first-team All-Pro selections. He did all of this while frequently arriving late to NFL training camps because he was finishing baseball seasons. Whatever the logistical cost of the dual career, it didn't show up in the football results. The more interesting question is what baseball cost him in the other direction. He never played a full MLB season. He never had an extended stretch where he could develop as a hitter without the interruption of an NFL season waiting for him. His OPS plus of 89 and WAR of 5.5 represent a player who's genuinely below average at the plate, and there's a legitimate argument that a full commitment to baseball starting from when he entered the sport in 1989 could have produced a meaningfully different outcome. But the argument is entirely hypothetical, and it runs into a significant counterpoint. Sanders' baseball value was almost entirely speed based, and speed based players tend to age quickly. A full commitment to baseball might have produced a few more productive seasons and a higher WAR. It would not have produced a Hall of Fame baseball career. The athleticism translated to stolen bases, not to hitting. What the two sport career does add, unambiguously, is context for the athleticism. When you watch Sanders cover a receiver and think about what he was doing simultaneously in another professional sport, at a level most people who played only one sport in their entire lives never reached, it recalibrates the scale. He wasn't just the fastest cornerback in football. He was fast enough to be a professional baseball player who led his league almost in stolen bases. Those are not the same thing as being fast for a defensive back. The question gets asked constantly, so it deserves a direct answer, or at least a direct accounting of why the answer is complicated. The case for Sanders as the greatest cornerback in NFL history rests on a few pillars. His PFR Hall of Fame monitor of 171.03 is second among all defensive backs in the database. His coverage dominance in his prime, specifically the 1994 season, has no documented parallel in the available statistical record. The peer recognition across his career, from coaches and quarterbacks and opponents, consistently placed him in a category by himself, and the deterrence effect, the degree to which offenses reorganize their entire game plan around avoiding him, is the kind of impact that doesn't fit neatly to any box score, but is as real as any statistic. The case for Rod Woodson is also serious and shouldn't be dismissed. Woodson finished his career with 71 interceptions, 18 more than Sanders. He was a better tackler by any honest measure. He was more versatile, transitioning to safety late in his career and continuing to produce at a Pro Bowl level. He also won a Super Bowl and was named to the NFL 100 all-time team. By the completeness standard, doing everything the position asks, Woodson has a legitimate claim. Darrelle Revis from roughly 2009 to 2014 produced what many analysts consider the most technically complete coverage performance in documented NFL history. This period, known as Revis Island, when he essentially removed one receiver from every game plan. His career was shorter and his decline steeper, but at his absolute peak, argument that he was the most dominant coverage corner who ever played isn't unreasonable. Where most serious analysts land, Sanders was a superior athlete and the more electric player. Woodson was the more complete defensive back. Revis at his peak may have been the more technically precise coverage corner. The debate between the three is legitimate, and there is no answer the evidence forces definitively. What is not seriously contested is that Sanders belongs in the conversation. A player who nearly doubles the PFR Hall of Fame monitor average for his position, who earned 6 first team All Pro selections, who won D point honors, and who produced the kind of deterrence effect that quarterbacks and coaches have described for 3 decades is, at minimum, one of the 2 or 3 greatest cornerbacks in the history of the sport. The consensus on Sanders across both the analytical and mainstream communities is more unified than it was for Jeter or Iverson, with one significant fault line. On the football side, first ballot Hall of Famer, NFL 100 all time team, named to the all decade team of the 1990s in 2 separate capacities. The establishment recognition is as complete as it gets for a defensive player. PFF, which has done more rigorous positional analysis of defensive backs than any other outlet, views Sanders as one of the top 2 or 3 cornerbacks in NFL history, with the tackling caveat clearly noted. The fault line is the tackling question, and it splits along a fairly predictable line. People who watched Sanders play in the 1990s and experienced the coverage dominance firsthand tend to view the below average tackling as an acceptable trade off for something that was genuinely unprecedented. Analysts who approach his career through the lens of positional completeness, what a quarterback is supposed to do, view it as a meaningful caveat that should temper the legacy. Both camps are working from real evidence. The coverage dominance was real. The tackle avoidance was real. The question of which one you weight more heavily is a values question about what the cornerback position is for, and the data doesn't answer it for you. On the baseball side, the consensus is simpler: below average hitter, elite base runner, functional roster contributor who never committed to the sport fully enough to know what his ceiling might have been. The two sport achievement is viewed universally as a remarkable athletic accomplishment. The baseball career itself is viewed as a secondary body of work that adds context to the athleticism without meaningfully altering the football legacy in either direction. His college career at Florida State, three sport athlete who has two unanimous All American selections, the Jim Thorpe Award, a game saving interception in the Sugar Bowl, eighth place Heisman finish as a defensive player, is the foundation that everything else was built on, and it tends to get underweighted in the professional conversation. Deion Sanders is a top three greatest cornerback in the history of professional football and could very well sit at the number one spot of those three. That is the honest answer, and the evidence supports it. He was not a complete cornerback in the traditional sense. His tackling was below average for the position, and by his own admission, partly reflected a deliberate approach to managing contact, a real limitation, even if a minor one relative to what he was doing on the coverage side. A corner who under tackles forces teammates to compensate. Sanders' teams compensated because the coverage value was worth it. That doesn't mean the cost wasn't real. His football peak, specifically the 1994 season with the 49ers, stands as one of the most dominant individual defensive performances in NFL history. Three interception return touchdowns, 303 return yards, D-point honors, third in MVP voting, Super Bowl champion. The deterrence effect on top of all of that, while impossible to fully quantify, was documented by enough quarterbacks and coaches over enough years to be treated as real evidence rather than mythology. The baseball career adds something real to the evaluation, even if it adds it indirectly. It doesn't elevate his football legacy. What it does is recalibrate the scale of the athleticism that football legacy was built on. He wasn't just the fastest player on the field. He was fast enough to hold a professional roster spot in two major sports for over a decade simultaneously. Where does he rank all time among cornerbacks? The Rod Woodson conversation is legitimate and doesn't have a clean resolution. Woodson was more complete, Sanders was more dominant in coverage. If you define the position by what it asks of a player in full, Woodson has a case. If you define it by how thoroughly one player can remove an opposing weapon from a game plan, Sanders has a case. Both are defensible. So, how good was Deion Sanders actually? He was a player who redefined what a cornerback could be by refusing to be what the position had always been. He built a career on the threat of what he might do rather than the documentation of what he did, and in doing so, created one of the most compelling and legitimately debated legacies in the history of the sport. The tackle avoidance was a weakness, but the coverage dominance was historically rare. The two sport achievement has no parallel, and the 1994 season, by itself, is the strongest argument anyone has ever made that one player can change what an offense is willing to attempt. Deion Sanders was one of the most electrifying athletes who ever lived, not just in football or baseball, but in any sport, at any position, in any era. Everybody knew prime time. The chains, the flair, the high step, the warranted cockiness backed up by the production to justify every single bit of it. He played three sports at the highest level in college and two professionally, and the argument that he was the most purely gifted athlete in American sports history isn't a stretch. He didn't just play cornerback, he invented a version of it that didn't exist before him and influenced every shutdown corner who came after. The tackling caveat is real, and it belongs in the evaluation. So does this. The player who made entire offenses restructure their game plan around avoiding one side of the field, who showed up to NFL training camps late because he was finishing a baseball season, and yet still won two Super Bowls and a Defensive Player of the Year award. That player has a legitimate claim to being the best cornerback who ever played.